So welcome everyone back to this phenomenal space traffic management conference. Our next roundtable is going to be international and other perspectives relevant to space traffic management. So I leave you here with Regina Peldszus, who's going to moderate this and take it away.
Thank you so much, Moribah, and hello and good evening or good morning to all of you in the audience and on our panel. We have a wonderful panel on international and other perspectives today. My name is Regina Peldszus. I'm with DLR Space Agency and currently seconded to the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy, where I focus on space situational awareness and space security, including the European Union Space Surveillance and Tracking Program. And I'm really delighted to welcome all our panelists that we have here today, which have very different perspectives that encompass space agencies and non-governmental institutions from the UK, Australia, Japan, the US, and China. So welcome to you all. And just a couple of housekeeping remarks on how we proceed. We'll hear from each of the panelists a few introductory remarks before we enter a discussion with everyone. And the audience, you're very welcome to add your questions to the Q&A function inside the chat, which we'll monitor, which will also be logged, and we hope to get as many questions as we can. And we start with our first speaker this evening, Mert Evirgen, Doctor of Researcher in Space Law with the University of Northumbria.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, Regina, I think you cut out at the end. Is it okay if we just go ahead now?
Oh, yes, please. Thank you, Mert.
Yeah,
I was giving you the floor. Thank you.
Right, okay. Yeah, hi, everyone. So I'm here with the Space Law Games. And just before I get into explaining what we're doing, I want to give a quick brief overview of our project. So I'm working alongside Northumbria and Northumbria University and Northern Space and Security to create a project called the Space Law Games. Now, it's a collaboration of industry and academia to address the lack of legal certainty and protection out of space. And we're combining various methodologies, including military wargaming, forensic investigation, and mooting to prepare a legal toolkit for tribunals and practitioners involved in space operations. There's 5 fundamental research questions that underpin our research. The first one being, how could collision events have been avoided? The identification of roles and responsibilities in avoiding such outcomes. When the event can't be avoided, building on the past 2 points, what evidence is required not to properly assign fault? What are the issues, both theoretical and practical, of entering that evidence into legal proceedings? And finally, what are the responsibilities to all parties for the continued existence of risk arising from collision events? To address these research questions, we have a certain set of phases that we are going through. We prepare a scenario with various stakeholders, experience and expertise involved. Then we run that through a military wargaming scenario. Then we arrive at our forensic investigations phase, and then we take it to a legal moot court. We're currently in what we call our forensic investigation, or the accident investigation phase. And we are looking currently at space traffic management through a legal lens, so to speak, to identify the structural limitations that need addressing and the positive behaviors which can be applied to the rest of the industry. We, as I mentioned, in August, we did our legal military war game that encompassed our current phase of the geo war games. So we have a scenario in the geospace, and we ran it through a military war game type scenario with lots of experts that we had from a wide industrial perspective and international as well as academic. And this wargame methodology, when we did it, it wasn't to predict the location of objects. So we're not trying to pinpoint where they were. It's more to gauge the reaction of the decision makers on Earth. And then based on these reactions and the analysis that we're preparing, we go into the accident investigation, which is a forensic approach where we establish which data sources exist to support an investigation and how accessible these data sources are, and crucially, whether they will provide us with a clear picture of what's happened. If we look at international law, it's argued that quite a lot of the time it's inefficient, whereas I would argue actually it's quite clear. They have very clear bases on what is done. If there's an accident in outer space, it's fault basis. But how do we assign fault? That's the problem. The real struggle we have is that, especially in space traffic management, is that we can't usually pinpoint what evidence is, where something is, and we can't back it up either. And one of the clear aims that we have is to build a picture of the actions and the data. So it's finding out what is valid data, what is an action or an inaction, and all these things that lead up to the event and create the event, so that if taken, if analyzed within our sort of process, you can figure out where something went wrong, where something was done right, because we don't want to point fingers at people. That's not our aim. Our aim is to empower the users of space through space traffic management, through the legal aspect, through the practitioners. It's to give everyone the means to be able to figure out where something went wrong, which is the thing that we struggle with the most. Within our sort of methodology for forensic investigation, we are combining a variation of terrestrial accident investigation. So we're looking at the sort of aspects of aircraft investigation, maritime, automobile, nuclear. So things where there's quite a lot of there's quite a lot on the line, and if something goes wrong, it requires a lot of effort to figure out what's going on from a lot of different angles. We also recognize that as this is extraterrestrial, that you can't just marry terrestrial processes to space and hope it works, as we are all aware. So we are trying to combine as many of the best practices of terrestrial work into terrestrial, as well as combining various stakeholders' opinions, as well as current investigatory practice in space, to create the best sort of toolkit that we can. Now, I feel like I'm potentially going to my 5 minutes there, Regina. Am I close to it, or because I'm happy to stop there?
Very close. Please finish your point. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean that's essentially it. I mean we're also aware that these. But I mean, essentially, these terrestrial investigations provide us with a starting point for developing a better methodology to clear the uncertainty of space, and that's our aim. It's not to point fingers. It's not to blame people. It's to help empower the space industry. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mert. And we'll carry on with Dr. Mary Pellec, who's the Director of Space Sustainability and SSA at the Australian Space Agency.
Thanks, Regina. And I would be very curious to hear about the results from Mert and to know what is the reaction with the next collision in space. That's very interesting. On my side, so the reason why there is a director for space situational awareness at the Australian Space Agency is because SSA and STM is one of the 7 space priority areas that were identified in the agency strategy. Part of my role and for all the space priorities that we identified, we are creating a technology roadmap. So there is an SSA technology roadmap being developed right now, and it aims to outline the next 10 years of SSA for the Australian space sector. So it's really important for us right now to understand SSA, STM, and to identify the right thing to do. Obviously, Australia has a long experience of space, but the agency is quite new. We are a bit more than 2 years old. And the question now is how to do the right thing and how to achieve our vision and our goals. Vision being to be respectful in space, to be a responsible and respected space sector. And we also want to help the industry grow. So the question is, how do we do that while being respectful? So I guess the reason why we are doing all that is to try and understand what are the technologies that are needed now, what Australia can do to help with the global picture, what is the value we can bring to the table. Also, I guess, to try and understand what we need when we grow, and in a more complex, rapidly changing space, what do we need to do to start on the right foot, I would say. So really for the agency, it's about the technologies that we can develop on the ground and in space. And it's also about stakeholder coordination that Mert was defining very well, and the legal aspects that are also key when we talk about STM. So both are very important for us, and that's exactly what we're doing this year, trying to develop the strategy, the roadmap for the 10 years to come for Australia. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Marie. And we carry on with Takeuchi, who's a researcher at JAXA and the Institute of Space Law at Keio University. You.
Thank you, Regina. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very much delighted to be here again, especially in this panel together with these distinguished fellow panelists. I am a space lawyer working for JAXA and Keio University, and I've been conducting researches on the legal aspects of STM since around 2010. So for me, Dr. Diane Howard, the founder of this conference, is always shining there as the Northern Star for me. So, and this is my first time participating in this conference, and it is always my pleasure to be here, because this is, I think this is a unique opportunity for getting some new idea and information dedicated to STM. So today I'd like to share with you my idea that we need a comprehensive approach, or holistic approach, if you like, in formulating STM policy. And I think there is no governmental, no international intergovernmental documents around the world fulfilling this comprehensiveness. So let me share my slide here. In order to reach towards comprehensiveness of those necessary elements, we are making a research. This research is still ongoing. So today is a kind of an interim report to you, but we are making a comparative analysis of international documents, mainly the LTS guidelines, the US governmental documents, mainly the FAA and FCC regulations, and Japanese governmental documents, which are mainly the licensing criteria of the Cabinet Office, in order to find the gaps between those documents. Because we believe that those gaps will be the next discussion points at the agenda for the international community, as well as for the national policy making for the STM policy. So we are learning a lot of things through this analysis, but one of the most interesting remarks is that there are very few topics that only the international documents cover. Important topics, but very few. So on the other hand, there are still many topics that are regulated domestically, but not covered by the international documents. And we found that those topics that only covered by the domestic regulations, which are necessary to be discussed, their rationale in the international community, because STM rules need to be universal. There is no border in space. And we are aware that in COPUOS, there is a discussion about monitoring national implementation of the LTS guidelines, which are talking about the part B of this chart. And we think that the elements in part B are those already gained consensus in the international community, which have less controversial. But the interesting topics that needs to be shedding light are the remaining topics which belongs to the part A or part D in this chart. So based on those discussions, in the end of the day, we are reaching in a consensus. We're reaching in a result that in my research team that that is to propose a comprehensive picture of identifying the coverage of STM policy. So what I wanted to emphasize here in this chart is that the elements of STM policy are already there, so none of them are missing. We already having those elements within in certain policy or within a certain rules. But the problem is that those elements are all fragmented nationally and fragmented internationally. Therefore, at least in the principle, in the fundamental policy, we need to hold a picture like this to always coming back to the basics. Lastly, let me give you some updates on the Japanese STM policy through this slide. So this is a summary slide of STM related policy of Japan. I'm telling it is a STM related policy, but not directly STM policy, because it is only from the 2018 that the Japanese government using the term STM within their policy. However, last year, the Japanese government decided to establish a midterm STM policy and also formulating a set of licensing rules for on-orbit services. So we can see some substantive progress this year, and our research group is also aiming to input our study results to the government, of course. So that's about it for me, from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, you. And our next guest is Dr. Brian Weeden, Director of Program Planning at the Secure World Foundation. Brian.
Thanks, Regina. We at Secure World have been organizing a side event along with the big Amos SSA conference in Maui for the last several years, called the Amos Dialogues. And we will, for this particular event, we wanted to look back at what has happened over the 8 years we've been holding the dialogue, and sort of take a look at, you know, how have things changed in the SSA and now STM conversation, and then what still remain as sort of the big challenges. So I cover those in my in the paper I put up on the site. I'm just going to quickly highlight them here, and then I'm happy to expand on them in the discussion. So when we started the Amos Dialogue series, the goal was to have a off-the-record event where key stakeholders from industry, from governments, from private sector, different countries can all come together and sort of talk about SSA in the hope that it would enhance greater collaboration and cooperation so that everyone can improve their SSA capabilities. We had the very first one in 2013, and it's interesting to note that one of the big things that has changed since then is the willingness of those various stakeholders to come together and talk to each other. In 2013, we thought that it was sort of a matter of pride that we got the US government, the US military, to come and talk with the commercial sector and talk with the Space Data Association and talk with their colleagues in a couple other governments about SSA data sharing. That was a big step back in 2013. To the point where today the US government has signed more than 100 official sharing agreements with other countries in satellite operations. The second big change has been in the role of the private sector. 2013 was when former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, Doug Lavero, publicly asked the commercial sector to step up and help out the government and the military in providing SSA data. 6 months later, AGI launched their ComSpoc, and today there's at least a dozen companies that are involved either in selling data or providing analytical tools or software or running entire networks of data and their own analysis centers. Huge change in the commercial capability to provide SSA capabilities and SSA data. So those were the two big ones that we saw. Now, in terms of really big changes and improvements, so as far as the issues and themes that remain to be challenging, one is we've seen come up a couple times already today, is defining what SSA is and what it is. We started from, if those remember back in the good old days, we had something called space surveillance, and then that became space situational awareness, and then the U.S. military a couple of years ago shifted to space domain awareness, and now we have space traffic management. We also have space traffic coordination. And trying to figure out what all the different definitions mean. Are they actually different at all, or are they just different labels for the same thing, is a significant challenge. And I think, you showed a chart with sort of, a comparison of several of these things, and some of them mean the same thing. Some of them are talking about different things. The inclusion of international participants in these discussions has improved quite a bit over the last several years, but still a lot more could be done there. And I would say in two areas. There are countries like India and South Korea, Japan, and Australia. They all are making really good progress on developing their own national policies and capabilities for SSA. And of course, the European Union has their program, and then ESA has another, the SSA program going on. But many, many other countries are still in the very early stages, and they all have satellites that they're either supervising or operating, and so they need to be part of that program. And then also, it is still extremely difficult to bring in Russia and China to discuss these discussions along with the US and other major actors. And we kind of have to have all the major powers there. Along those lines, another recurring theme is the importance of trust, and just how difficult it is to kind of have that trust so you can share data more broadly, and how you can trust, accepting data from different sources. That's a real challenge. On the commercial side, while there's certainly more commercial capabilities, there's still an ongoing discussion about what is the proper role of the private sector versus the role of the government. Can we just turn all this over to the private sector, or is there still a public good aspect of SSA that needs to be figured out? And then there's sort of how to define future SSA requirements. A lot of the existing SSA capabilities were developed by militaries for some military things, like missile warning. They weren't designed to do space traffic management, or they weren't designed to do some of these safety tasks. And so there's a huge question of what do we actually need as far as technical capabilities, coverage, errors, all those sorts of things to support the not only what we're doing today, but what's coming in the future. And then finally, I would say there's still a lot of work to be done in the role of SSA in supporting diplomatic and policy efforts on responsible behavior in space. Something we've heard earlier today a couple different times. Over the last 8 years, there's been a lot of discussion on the LTS guidelines and COPUOS, and several of those guidelines include SSA components. But I think that there needs to be more discussion, not only how do we deal with existing practices, but how can SSA do things like space traffic management, actually putting in some actual governmental regulations, some oversight, and then things in the security domain like arms control and potentially verification. So I will stop there. That's just a quick summary of things we saw, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Brian. Wonderful. And last up, we have Dr. Huifeng, who's with the International Academy of Astronautics. And Huifeng, I'm not sure if you can hear or see us, and maybe you can give us a small sign that you're still online. I think we've lost them, but I would propose that perhaps we go ahead with our discussion, and please come in and give us a little sign as soon as you can reconnect, and we'll take it from there, and we of course give you another chance to include your remarks. Okay, I hope that's okay. So thank you so much to all the panelists so far. I think we've heard some really interesting perspectives on the different ways to engage as stakeholders, not just internationally, but also in the whole of government approaches within and across different sectors. And I think it was really interesting to hear how some of these approaches can be evocative. Some of them can be, really highlight certain accidents that could happen, certain scenarios that we see. Some of them are very inclusive, really doing the painstaking dialogue of going through all the different interests and contributions of the partners to find common grounds, to exchange and to translate, and of course also comparative of really going into the depths of the different policies. And perhaps before we start from questions with questions from the audience who are very who will get towards some individual panelists, I want to just pose a follow-up question to all panelists. When when you do your stakeholder engagement, which all of you have highlighted from your various perspectives, can you highlight that once you've put the dialogue in place, once you've got the different actors around the table, which Brian, you highlighted as already a challenge sometimes, can you give us a little bit of an insight on how you reconcile different interests, how you persuade different actors perhaps to step back from their interest and see another side, and maybe what kind of persuasion and translation work is involved in that? And I'll shoot this back to all the panelists.
So, I mean, that's the multi-billion-dollar question, right? I'm sorry, you say. So that's a hugely important question, right? And a lot of that comes down to just, I mean, that's diplomacy, that's negotiation, that is, you know, human behavior in small groups. All of those are sort of key things. I would say, I mentioned trust. I would just sort of foot stomp that again. One of the biggest challenges is how can you build trust between the different stakeholders, particularly when doing things like data sharing, right? There's a lot of, well, if I'm going to take your data, how do I know your data is any good? Or how do I know that, you know, buried in your data is not some sort of a cyber attack or something along those lines? There are certainly, I think there's a lot of tools in the data science world that is already dealing with kind of big data problems that are pulling from multiple different sources. Lots of different analytical and statistical tools you can use to help tell bad data, you know, those sorts of things. I think the space world has not really looked at those a lot. But outside of that, I mean, I think you just sort of, I mean, my experience, you build it off of just recurring behavior, right? And contact. We have building relationships. We have, you know, those very first couple of Amos Dialogues where people are very reluctant to share data. Some of those same people now, 8 years later, have much better relationships they've built with other people in the dialogue and are much more open and willing to talk about things.
Thank you so much, Brian. Marie, can you add something? You highlighted the stakeholder challenge as well.
Absolutely, and I guess it's not even, it's even right inside the agency that the challenge is, because the purpose of the Australian Space Agency is to grow the industry. So we want to support the growth of the space sector, but at the same time, we have to do it in a responsible way. So one way, we want more spacecrafts in orbit for Australia. The other way, we have to make sure that it won't create more issues. So we do have this issue every day, and we are consulting every day with the industry to try and identify the right way to do this. And in my view, and in our view, when we do this consultation, I think the kind of one solution for Australia that is slightly different from other countries that have been in space forever and have so many things in space already. For us, there is an opportunity to start with the right rules and the right things, the right technologies. So that's what we are exploring, not to damage the industry, because we want the industry to grow, but to grow responsibly. So that's exactly what we're doing now, trying to make SSA and STM an opportunity for the industry, the Australian space industry, and not just a, oh, crap, I also need to do, I know, debris mitigation plan. It's like we want to see it as an opportunity.
Wonderful, thank you. Any of the other panelists wish to add something?
If I may.
I see you, yes.
Yes, thanks. Well, I'm not repeating what the other panelists said. It is very challenging, and we need to have a comprehensive discussion, even within the country as well. But as a practitioner working in a daily life, living in a daily life, having those kind of negotiations together with the different counterparts, I would like to point out two things, especially difficult in this field. One thing is that the dealing with the people, I mean, negotiating with the people in the national security area. Those are, and we need to understand, we need to try to understand their philosophy, the different culture. I am living in the civil space, so I am not very familiar with those daily works, but and they are hidden in the secrecy, so it is very difficult to figure out what they are really thinking and what are their real concern, because it's not the open source the information. However, the importance is that we have to we need to try to understand what their incentives, and we need to have a comprehensive. We need to have the philosophy to work together for the government. The second thought is that the importance is to have a kind of a global viewpoint, because I think we need to, in order to formulate the STM policy, we need to look into the global operation of the spacecraft, because space, we don't have any border on space. In the space operation, we are always together with the universal operators operating in the same area. So we need to think about the entire and the sustainable space activities. Otherwise, it comes down to our own interest or our own damage if we lack in those viewpoints.
Thank you so much, Hugh. I think it's a really important point on how we grapple to fit together all the different interests. Mert, perhaps you want to comment, and maybe if I may, I would like to combine that with a question that came in for you particularly, and perhaps you can highlight how you're doing this or implementing this within the space law games on invoking these different contributions. The question is whether there's a discussion of general international law and whether that's applicable, and what the relationship is between the different regimes, legal regimes. And sometimes it appears that lex specialis aspect of outer space law is understood in a way that self-isolates the regime, but that's not entirely possible. And there's a reference to the law of the treaties. Can you comment maybe on how you, in your space law games, on how you go from the very specific, special questions such as this to getting a consensus?
Yeah, I think I will end up echoing the panelists, because they all said things that I completely agree with. But to start with, I mean, from a research and project creation perspective, I mean, working within the industry and academic background, with working with a variety of stakeholders, it's about, for me and for us, focusing on what's mutually beneficial, the mutual main goal for all the participants, because there will be things that everyone has different opinions on and disagrees with, but it's about how you phrase your hypothesis and your work with one another, because especially like within the line of work, sort of the space law games and what we're trying to create, if it's a finger pointing exercise, it will end up with everyone around the same table pointing fingers at each other, and we won't get anywhere. So what we try to focus on is what is mutually beneficial for everyone. So it's, for example, we focused first of all in the war game on the individual participants and experts' reactions to the event to figure out which each international perspective, academic, industrial, practitioner perspective, to see how they perceived it and what they brought to the table and what they needed from the other groups. So it's about building the connections, so it's diagnosing what is there, what may not be there, and then off the positive strand of that, providing that link to each other. So if we recognize that, say, Group A knows something Group B doesn't, rather than pointing out Group B doesn't know this, it's nudging or providing Group A an incentive to provide Group B with that. So that's one thing that we sort of diagnose. It's sort of work in a mutually beneficial way. And a second one that I think this takes a lot from the panelists actually is the almost objectivity as well as worldwide perspective that's required, because each nation, each stakeholder, each company has a very different perspective on how these things must be done, but also because everyone has an independent bias, understandably. I mean, bias isn't a negative word here. Every nation stakeholder, every commercial stakeholder will unsurprisingly have their own way of doing it, because it'll be the way that benefits them the most, but it's also tying it in for a way that benefits their practice as well as everyone else's practice. So that's kind of how I focus on it. In terms of the space law question, there are a lot of questions in space law, because we obviously have the this is, like, I think to quote Brian, the $1 million question. We have a lot of branches of space law. Each nation looks at things differently. I mean, for example, Luxembourg and the US have space mining law, whereas lots of other nations don't. So it's about how to focus on it. So far, we're getting well, because we're currently in our forensic investigation side, and the evidence and the analysis we get from the forensic investigation will lead to our legal moot. That's still in preparation, but we're currently aiming at more of an international law basis. So it can be a coverall, it can be a toolkit that can be applied by the nation itself. Because, I mean, right now, the best thing we all have to rely upon is the national law, international law as a basis. So it's using that with the best parts of the practice that we've picked up on through our working with key stakeholders in international space law. So, I mean, I hope that answers the question. If there's a bit you think I've missed, please do repeat, because there's a lot to sort of try and address there.
Wonderful. No, I think that was really interesting. Thanks so much, Mert. I have another question that somewhat ties into your point also on the different interests from Charlie McGillis for Marie. It is exciting that Australia and other nations have a blank piece of paper for establishing space capabilities. What has the Australia Space Agency learned from seeing how other nations approach STM? Are they going different? And I think that's a super interesting question on what everyone can bring to the table in terms of fresh insight. Marie, maybe you can comment, and whoever wishes to follow up, please go ahead.
Sure. So I guess in terms of learnings, what I was saying before, in terms of we are pretty new, so we can see what others have been doing. And definitely what we've learned is that we can't do it alone. We won't create a new a new SSA network, sensor network, just for Australia, because we know that it is a global thing, and we can't just recreate something and hope that we will have enough data for ourselves and for the world. So we just want to identify how to bring something to the table. So we won't do another completely autonomous sensor network. We also understand that regulation is a major aspect, and every single panelist here is talking about it. Obviously, we could create the best regulation for Australia. If it's just us, it won't work, because it will only apply to our satellites, our industry, and everything else will stay the same. So instead of, and on top of that, we will penalize our own industry by putting very strict rules when others won't have that. So they will all go somewhere else to send their spacecraft to the sky. So really what we have to do is to work globally with Scorpius and other forums to try and not just do something Australian, but something global for SSA and STM. So that's definitely something that we learned. And I guess something that is also important. So we talked about soft law, and that everything looks there, and you said that quite well with the diagram he had, in terms of we have all the pieces. The question is how we implement that. So we are working on this implementation part, because we believe that that's the key to not having just something nice, but having rules that will help, and not just rules, but also guidance for the industry to try and help them identify the right way. And I guess in terms of difference, I can't say that we will do something perfect because we are new. The only advantage that we have is that, I guess, for the other countries that have been there for ages, they have to go through a massive shift in the way they're doing things, because before you could send a satellite and there was no real impact, when now you're told that it will be a risk of space junk and you have to think about the end of life. And it's like a very big shift for some people, when for us it can be embedded in how we do things right now. So I guess that's what we're trying to work on, grow the industry, not put rules, but guide, and try to help them identify the opportunity and the strengths that Australia would have that would give them value for all these SSA and STM aspects, so that it's not just something they have to do, it's an opportunity.
Thank you so much, Marie. I want to, I'm very conscious of our time. We only have, well, 0 or 1 or 2 minutes left today, but I want to just jump off of one of the other questions from the audience, from Ken to Brian, on the role of, you know, the transition from the military to the private side for SSA, and, you know, what's ensuing on STM. So maybe I would invite each of you to maybe just throw a couple of keywords at us on where you think the priorities for the private sector or for the governmental sector should be before we close. And Brian, maybe I can jump this on you if you'd like to start. Very short.
So to Ken's question, which is great, I would say that I think at the time, Livero's comments were more of him as a policy entrepreneur than reflective of it's a whole of government support for this. And there's still, I mean, there's a lot of think of it this way. You know, if you're the government, your choice is either we get, you know, several $1 billion a year or $1 billion a year to build our own stuff, or maybe we get $100 million a year to buy stuff from somebody else. There are some organizational incentives to pick one of those over the other. If you're in the organization, your job is to build cool stuff and operate cool stuff. So bureaucratically, there's still a lot of work to be done on terms of supporting and utilizing commercial services.
Thank you, Brian. And you and Matt, do you have any points that you would like to bring across, maybe some keywords where you think we should be placing our priorities this year, either on the non-state or the state actor side?
Just to quickly jump in, I think the push into, personally, the non-state is quite a positive development. I think there's been the whole reason why we know that, like, for example, space law started is because of the Cold War, because of two states' interests, and pushing and for there to be more opportunities for there to be non-state involvement as well as curation of this data, of this sort of work, of this area, I think is very beneficial. And I think Brian's right. I think there will be a lot of bureaucracy behind it. There'll be a lot of issues that come with it, but I also think that it's a very positive development because it at least means that there's more variety in the data, which is crucial when gathering evidence for, I mean, even the project that I'm doing. Even with the space law games, it's vital that we have different sources of data to be able to find what's independently and objectively right.
Thank you, Mert. And you, a last word?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think I would just echo the Brian's and Mert statement that in order to promote the STM policy, we need some kind of a comprehensive approach or holistic approach, if you like, and that comprehensiveness should be universal, not domestic, since STM is not something that we can do within a country, within a single country, as Marie said. That's about it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, you, and thank you to all the panelists. It was a really interesting perspective that we got today from each of you, and I'm guilty for overrunning a few minutes. I think we could have continued the discussion, and I'm hoping that as we go along with the day tomorrow, that we can pick up further questions from the audience, perhaps weave them into the rest of the dialogue, particularly into into the security side as well. I want to thank you all, and I'm hoping you have a good evening or good afternoon. And Reba, I'll hand over to you again. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to all of you. Thanks for all the people that have participated, asked questions, attended. This is the way that we need to do things in our community, is wrestle with these concepts and the information. And I appreciate each and every one of you. I hope that you and yours are safe and healthy. And I'll open it up to see if Diane wants to say something here, but I'm very much looking forward to tomorrow, day 2. Lots of great conversations to have as well. Diane?
Yes, I just want to echo what Mariva said. It was wonderful. This really, the conference took on a whole different kind of tone and a very positive one. And it has been a wonderful thing to be a fly on the wall once again, listening. I look forward to tomorrow, and I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow also. Thank you for your participation. And thank you again to Ali and Strauss Center for putting this together, along with the help of the people at the IAA and the sponsors.
Here, 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 here. Thanks to Lockheed Martin, and yes, thanks to Strauss Center and Ali and everybody else. See you tomorrow, everybody.